I can imagine it vividly now, as if it happened yesterday, even though months have passed. I don't really like talking about it because, well, it still gives me chills. But, okay, if you really want to hear, I'll tell you. Just know it's not something I can easily forget. So I used to live alone in this small basement apartment. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was affordable. And for someone like me, who preferred to be by myself, it was perfect. The apartment was cozy enough, a little cramped with old furniture and peeling wallpaper, but it had a kind of charm. There was one thing, though. My window, you see, it was level with the sidewalk. Anyone walking by could easily peer in if they wanted to. I had heavy curtains to block out most of the light and the prying eyes, but the thought of being so exposed never really sat right with me. Anyway, it was an ordinary night at first. I was reading a book, some thriller I'd picked up from the library. I'm always into those suspenseful stories, but who knew I'd end up living one myself? It was quiet, except for the occasional rumble of a car driving by, or the wind outside making the trees creak. I could hear it through the little crack in my window where it didn't quite seal shut. The air was chilly, and I had wrapped myself in a thick blanket, trying to keep warm. I remember glancing at the clock. It was 3:15 a.m. Yeah, late, but I've always been a bit of a night owl. Just when I was about to put the book down and call it a night, I heard it. A soft knock on the window. Tap, tap, tap. At first I thought I was imagining it. I mean, who would be knocking on a basement window at this hour? I tried to brush it off, convincing myself it was just the wind or maybe a stray branch tapping against the glass. But then it happened again. Tap, 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 clear as day. No mistaking it this time. My heart started racing. You know that feeling when something just doesn't feel right? Yeah, it hit me hard right then. I sat up, listening, straining my ears to make sure I wasn't going crazy. Silence. I told myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the unease. I tried to focus on my book again, but I couldn't. The words were just blurring together. And then, tap, 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 even louder this time. It was like whoever, or whatever, was outside wanted to make sure I didn't miss it. I froze. Every hair on the back of my neck stood up. There's something deeply unsettling about hearing a knock at your window when you're underground. It's not like someone could just walk up to my door and ask for help. This was different. This was deliberate. I didn't know what to do. Should I look? Should I ignore it? My mind was racing, but my body refused to move. I kept staring at the window, waiting, listening for anything else. My apartment was deathly quiet now. No wind, no cars passing by, just the eerie stillness that follows when something is about to go horribly wrong. Tap, tap, tap. This time it was insistent, like it was demanding my attention. My stomach twisted, and I finally gathered the courage to peek through the curtain. Just a little, just enough to see. My heart was pounding in my ears, my throat tight. I pulled the fabric back, inch by inch, trying to make as little noise as possible. And then I saw it. Nothing. There was no one there. The street was empty, illuminated by the dim glow of a flickering street lamp. No movement, no shadows, just nothing. Relief washed over me for a second. Maybe I had imagined it after all. Maybe it was just my tired brain playing tricks on me. But before I could fully let that thought settle, the knocking started again. This time faster, more frantic. Tap, 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 tap. I jumped back from the window, my breath catching in my throat. What the hell was happening? I knew I wasn't imagining it now. Someone or something was out there. I grabbed my phone, my hands trembling as I fumbled to unlock it. My mind was screaming at me to call someone, anyone, but who would I call? The police? And tell them what? That I heard knocking on my window? They'd think I was crazy. Instead, I just stood there, phone in hand, staring at the window like it was about to burst open any second. The knocking stopped. Silence again, but this time it felt even heavier. Oppressive, almost. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching, waiting. Minutes passed. Or maybe it was only seconds. I couldn't tell. Time felt distorted. I finally took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down. Maybe it was just some drunk person stumbling by. Maybe they knocked on the wrong window and moved on. Yeah, that had to be it. But then I heard it. A sound I hadn't noticed before. Breathing. Slow, heavy breathing coming from the other side of the glass. I froze. My skin crawled with fear as I realized it was too loud, too clear to be anything else. Someone was standing right outside my window, right on the other side of that thin pane of glass, breathing, watching. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but somehow I managed to move. I backed away from the window, my heart slamming against my ribs, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I was halfway to the door when I heard the voice. "Let me in." It was barely a whisper, but I heard it. Low, raspy, desperate. My blood ran cold. No, that's all I could manage. I don't know if I even said it out loud, but in my head I screamed it. The voice didn't stop. "Let me in." This time it was louder, more insistent. My hand reached for the doorknob, my brain screaming at me to run, to get out. But I was paralyzed. Something about that voice, something wasn't right. It didn't sound human. It was distorted, like two voices layered on top of each other, one higher, one lower, creating this sickening harmony. Then the knocking started again. Furious, relentless, tap, 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 tap. It sounded like the glass would shatter at any moment. I couldn't take it anymore. I threw open the door and bolted up the stairs, my feet barely touching the steps. I didn't stop until I was outside, under the safety of the streetlight. I looked back at the basement window, half expecting to see a face staring back at me. But there was nothing, just darkness. I moved out the next day, never went back. I didn't even bother to pack most of my stuff. I just left it all behind. But sometimes I still hear it. That knocking, that voice. It doesn't matter where I am, it follows me. And the worst part, every time it happens, it's at 3:30 a.m. I don't usually talk about my dad's stories. I mean, he's not the kind of guy who'd scare easy, and growing up, I always thought he was making things up to keep me in line. You know, like those stories parents tell to make sure you don't wander too far at night or talk to strangers. But there was one story, one specific story, that always stayed with me. It was different. Even the way my dad told it felt real, like it was something he didn't want to remember but couldn't forget. I guess I should start from the beginning. My dad wasn't always the quiet, reserved guy he is now. Back in his youth, he was a lot more reckless, kind of a wild spirit. He'd always be off with his friends, getting into trouble, exploring abandoned buildings, sneaking into old factories, stuff like that. He grew up in a small rural town where there wasn't much to do but get yourself into trouble, especially after dark. That's when the town had its own secrets. Now this story takes place when my dad was about 19, living at home with his parents, my grandparents. He'd been back from a night out with his buddies, and they'd been up at this old barn just outside of town, a place people swore was haunted. My dad never believed in any of that, though. He was always the skeptic, the one to roll his eyes whenever anyone brought up ghosts or strange occurrences. At least, that's what he said at the time. It was late, past midnight, and the wind was howling outside. I always picture that night in my mind, and it's strange how the details stuck with me, like I can feel them myself. You know that biting cold that creeps into your bones? That's how it was, he said, with the wind rattling the windows, the air so crisp it hurt to breathe. He'd just gotten home, kicked off his boots by the door, and was sitting at the kitchen table trying to warm up. My grandmother, his mom, was already in bed, and the house was quiet. He didn't know it yet, but that night would change him forever. It started with a noise, a faint creaking sound, like wood bending under pressure, but it wasn't coming from outside where the wind was. It was coming from the attic above him. Now the attic in their house was hardly ever used. It was one of those cramped, dusty spaces where old junk piled up over the years. Nobody ever went up there unless they needed to dig out something long forgotten. So naturally, hearing anything from the attic was enough to make him pause. He figured it was the wind, but it wasn't long before he heard it again. Creak, creak, like footsteps. He tried to brush it off. Maybe a raccoon had found its way inside, or maybe it was just the house settling. He'd heard those noises before growing up, the kind of sounds you get used to when you've lived somewhere long enough. But something about this was different. The creaking continued, steady, deliberate, moving slowly across the ceiling above him, almost as if someone, or something, was pacing back and forth. When he reached the attic door, he hesitated. He'd never felt that way before, this overwhelming sense that something was wrong. But he pushed it aside. He was a skeptic, remember? He wasn't going to let some creaky floorboards and a weird smell freak him out. He opened the door slowly. The hinges squealed, the sound sharp in the stillness of the night. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing old trunks, dusty boxes, and piles of forgotten memories. But there was nothing out of the ordinary. No raccoon, no intruder, just silence. That's when he saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the attic, barely illuminated by the dim glow of his flashlight. At first, he thought it was a shadow, a trick of the light. But then it moved. Slowly, it turned toward him. My dad told me he couldn't see its face clearly, but he could feel it watching him, its eyes piercing through the darkness. For a moment, he couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. It wasn't fear that held him in place, he said, but something else, something deeper, something that reached into his chest and gripped his heart. He knew he should run, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. Then the figure spoke, just one word. My dad said it was barely more than a whisper, but he heard it as clear as day. Leave. He didn't need to be told twice. He turned and bolted down the stairs, slamming the attic door behind him. His heart was pounding in his chest as he ran through the house, straight to his parents' room. He banged on their door, breathless, trying to explain what had just happened. But when my grandparents opened the door, they didn't seem surprised. My grandfather, who'd always been a quiet man, just nodded. "I've seen him too," he said. "He doesn't like us up there." I remember when my dad told me this part. The look on his face, it was like he was reliving the moment all over again. He told me that was the first and last time he ever went up to the attic. After that, the door stayed locked, and they never spoke about it again. But the house wasn't the same after that. There was always a sense of something watching, something waiting. Years later, when my grandparents moved out of that house, my dad went back one last time to help them pack up. He said he didn't feel that presence anymore, but he could still remember it, every detail. And to this day, he refuses to talk about it much. I think it's because, deep down, he knows that whatever was in that attic wasn't just a figment of his imagination. He's not a superstitious man, my dad, but he's never been the same since that night. I think part of him is still up there in that attic, locked away with whatever was pacing those floorboards, waiting for someone else to come along and disturb its peace. I've asked him a few times if he ever thought about going back, just to see if it was all in his head, but every time I bring it up, he just shakes his head. Some things are better left alone, he always says. And after hearing that story, I can't say I disagree. Now, I've never experienced anything like that myself, but whenever I visit my dad, I can see it in his eyes. This flicker of unease, like he's still waiting for something to happen, still expecting to hear those footsteps again, still bracing himself for the day when whatever was up there decides it's not finished with him yet. And you know what? Every time I think about it, I get this weird feeling in my chest, like I shouldn't be talking about it, like somehow just telling the story might bring it back. So maybe I'll stop here. But I'll tell you one thing, I haven't been able to look at attics the same way since. So yeah, ever since that story, I've had this uneasy feeling about attics. I don't even think I'm scared of them, exactly. It's more like a deep, nagging suspicion that something's just waiting to be found. Or, maybe worse, something that's hoping it won't be found. It's strange, you know? You hear a story like that, and it sticks with you in ways you don't expect. But there's more to the story than just my dad's experience. It turns out, it wasn't the only time something weird happened in that house. He didn't tell me this next part until years later, like he didn't want to acknowledge it himself. He's the type to bottle things up, thinking they'll go away if he doesn't talk about them. One night, when I was about 12, I couldn't sleep. I was staying at my grandparents' house for the summer, just like I did every year. I remember the air was thick and heavy, like a storm was coming, but the sky was clear. I was tossing and turning in bed, restless, my thoughts racing for no reason. It must have been close to midnight when I heard it, a soft creaking sound. It was faint, barely noticeable, but it reminded me of the story my dad had told me. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but my imagination wouldn't let me go. I listened harder, waiting for the sound to repeat. And then it came again, that low, groaning noise, like wood bending under weight. The exact sound my dad had described. Now, the rational part of me thought it was just the house settling. Old houses make noise, right? They creak and groan as they adjust to the weather. But the way this noise carried through the silence of the night, it was too deliberate, too rhythmic. Like something was pacing, just like my dad had said all those years ago. I laid there, frozen, staring up at the ceiling, waiting for it to stop. But it didn't. The creaking continued, steady and slow. It was coming from the attic. I could feel my pulse in my throat, my hands clammy under the covers. I told myself it wasn't real, that I was just remembering the story and letting it get to me. But then I heard another sound. A soft thud, like something heavy had been dropped. I shot up in bed, my heart racing. I could hear the blood pounding in my ears, my breath coming out in shaky gasps. I wasn't imagining it. Something was up there. The worst part was, I knew I couldn't go to my grandparents. My grandpa was a no-nonsense kind of guy, and he wouldn't take kindly to me waking him up in the middle of the night over a noise. And my grandma, well, she was kind, but she was the type who always had explanations for everything, always trying to soothe worries with logic. But logic wasn't going to help me right now. I don't know what came over me, but I did something I still can't explain. I got out of bed. My feet touched the cold wooden floor, and I stood there for a moment, listening, waiting. The house felt different. It was like the air had shifted, heavy with something I couldn't name. The creaking stopped, but that made it worse, somehow. The silence was louder, more oppressive, as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for me to make a move. I took a few cautious steps toward the door, every instinct in my body screaming at me to turn back, to climb under the covers and forget it. But I couldn't. It was like I was being pulled forward by some unseen force, some part of me needing to know what was making those sounds. The hallway was dark, and the old wooden floor creaked under my weight as I walked. The attic door was at the end of the hall, just a pull-down ladder leading up to a small hatch in the ceiling. It was shut tight, as it always was. My grandparents didn't go up there much, except to store old things. That door hadn't been opened in years. But as I stood there, staring up at it, something felt wrong. The air around it was colder, like a draft was coming from the attic, even though the door was sealed. I reached out, almost without thinking, my hand brushing against the cord that would pull the ladder down. The second I touched it, the attic creaked again. I froze, my hand trembling as I stood there, barely breathing. There was no mistaking it now. There was something, or someone, up there. And then I heard the voice. It wasn't loud, just a whisper, barely more than a breath. But I heard it, clear as day. It was the same word my dad had heard all those years ago. Leave. My legs gave out, and I stumbled backward, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I turned and bolted back down the hallway, back into my room, slamming the door behind me. I jumped into bed, pulling the covers over my head, trying to block out the sound, the feeling, the fear. I stayed there, shaking, listening for any sign that it had followed me. But the house was quiet again. Too quiet. I lay there for what felt like hours, my mind racing, replaying the voice over and over again. That one word echoing in my head, leave. The next morning, I didn't say anything. I couldn't. How could I explain what had happened? They'd think I was just a kid with an overactive imagination, that I'd let my dad's story get the better of me. So I kept it to myself. But something had changed in me after that night. I felt like the house was watching me, like the attic was more than just a storage space. It was alive somehow, aware of anyone who dared to get too close. I didn't sleep well for the rest of the summer. Every night I'd lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the creaking to start again. It never did. But I could still feel it, lurking, just out of reach, waiting for the next time someone got too curious. When I finally went home at the end of the summer, I told my dad what happened. I thought he'd laugh, or maybe tell me it was just my imagination. But instead, he went quiet. He looked at me with this strange, knowing expression, like he understood exactly what I was talking about. I told you, he said, his voice low. Some things are better left alone. We never spoke of it again. I've never gone back to that house. My grandparents have since passed, and the house has been sold. But sometimes when I'm lying awake at night, I still think about it. The attic, the voice, the feeling of something watching, waiting. and I wonder if, somewhere in the dark, it's still there. You ever have one of those feelings, like something's wrong before anything even happens? Like you get this chill in your bones, this uneasy feeling you can't shake, even though everything around you seems fine? That's how I felt when my family decided to go camping last summer. It was supposed to be a fun trip, you know? A break from everything, work, school, life. My dad had found this campsite deep in the woods, far away from the usual crowded spots, and he was excited to get out there with me and my younger sister Megan. At first I was all for it. I mean, we'd been camping before and it had always been a good time. But then, a few nights before the trip, I watched this movie, a horror film of course, about this deer. Sounds ridiculous, right? A deer. But in the movie, this thing wasn't just any deer. It had these weird, almost human-like eyes, and the way it would just stand there, watching the characters in the film without moving, without blinking, it freaked me out more than I want to admit. Even after the movie was over, that image stuck with me. Those eyes just staring. So when we finally headed out for the trip, that feeling of unease I'd been carrying didn't go away. The drive took us deeper into the woods than I'd expected. We left the main roads behind, turning onto dirt paths that seemed barely wide enough for the car. The trees around us were thick, casting long shadows that flickered across the car as we passed. Megan was sitting next to me in the back seat, her face glued to her phone, oblivious to everything outside. My dad, of course, was humming to some old rock tune, excited about the adventure. But me, I couldn't help but feel like those woods were closing in around us. We arrived at the campsite late in the afternoon. The sun was already dipping low, casting an orange glow across the treetops. It was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no rustling in the underbrush, just this heavy stillness that seemed unnatural. My dad got out of the car, stretching and breathing in the air like it was the freshest thing he'd ever tasted. "Perfect spot, huh?" he said, smiling over at me. I tried to smile back, but something about the place just felt wrong. I brushed it off, though, thinking I was still spooked from the stupid movie. We set up camp pretty quickly. 2 tents, one for me and Megan, one for my parents. The fire was going, dinner was cooking, and for a while, things felt almost normal. The woods around us seemed a little less menacing in the firelight. Megan was in a good mood too, chatting about some YouTube drama, completely unaware of my growing discomfort. But then, as the light faded and the shadows around our camp grew longer, that feeling came back, stronger this time. I kept catching myself looking out into the trees, half expecting to see something there. Something watching. My dad noticed, of course, because he's always been good at picking up on stuff like that. "You all right, kid?" he asked, leaning back in his camping chair, a beer in his hand. "Yeah," I lied, trying to shake off the tension. "Just tired, I guess." He nodded, but I could tell he didn't believe me. He let it go, though, and after dinner, we all sat around the fire for a bit before turning in for the night. That's when things really started to go south. Megan and I crawled into our tent, zipped up our sleeping bags, and she fell asleep almost instantly. I, on the other hand, couldn't relax. I kept hearing things, small, barely noticeable sounds coming from the woods. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, like something was moving out there, just beyond the light of the dying fire. I kept telling myself it was probably a raccoon or maybe a deer, but that did little to calm me down. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see those human-like eyes from the movie, staring at me from the darkness. I don't know how long I lay there, but at some point, I must have dozed off. When I woke up, it was dark, really dark. The fire outside had burned down to embers, casting only the faintest glow. The air was cold, colder than it should have been for a summer night. But what woke me up wasn't the cold. It was the silence. There was nothing. No wind, no animals, not even the usual creaking of trees, just this dead, heavy silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I lay there, frozen, listening, and then I heard it, a soft rustling, not far from the tent. I turned my head slowly, heart pounding in my chest. The sound was coming from the trees, but it wasn't like an animal moving through the brush. It was deliberate, like something was pushing its way through the undergrowth, trying to stay quiet but not quite managing. My breath caught in my throat, and I strained my ears, trying to make sense of the noise. Then I saw it. Through the thin mesh of the tent, silhouetted against the faint glow of the fire, was a shape. At first I thought it was a tree or maybe a branch swaying in the breeze, but then it moved, slowly, gracefully. A tall, slender figure, stepping between the trees, its movements almost unnatural. It took a step closer, and that's when I saw them, the eyes. They were reflective, catching the faint light of the embers, but they weren't like animal eyes. They were too large, too human. My blood ran cold. It was a deer, or at least it looked like one. But something was wrong with it. Its body was twisted in a way that didn't seem possible, its neck too long, its legs too thin, and those eyes, they were locked onto the tent. Watching, waiting. I wanted to scream, to wake Megan, to get my parents, but I couldn't move. I just lay there, paralyzed by fear as the thing stared at us. It didn't move for what felt like an eternity, just stood there half hidden in the trees, watching. And then, without warning, it turned and disappeared into the shadows. I let out a shaky breath, my body trembling. I didn't know what I'd just seen, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't sleeping that night. Hours passed and the night dragged on. I kept listening for any sign of the thing, but the woods had gone silent again. It wasn't until the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn that I started to relax, just a little. I told myself that whatever it was gone. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe I'd just let that stupid movie get to me. But then, just as I was starting to drift off again, the tent ripped open. I didn't have time to react before something grabbed me, yanking me out of the tent with a force that knocked the wind out of me. I hit the ground hard, my head spinning, and for a moment, I couldn't see anything. Just darkness and cold air. When I finally managed to focus, I saw it again. The deer, or whatever it was, loomed over me, its body hunched and contorted, its face inches from mine. Those eyes, God, those eyes, stared down at me with this eerie intelligence, like it knew exactly what it was doing. Its breath was hot and rancid, and the sound it made, it wasn't a growl or a snarl, but this horrible guttural noise. A cross between a human scream and an animal's cry. I kicked, thrashed, tried to get away, but its grip was like iron. It dragged me through the dirt, pulling me toward the trees, and I could feel the ground tearing at my skin, my legs kicking helplessly. Then I felt it, a sharp, searing pain in my leg. I screamed, the pain blinding, and I kicked harder, desperate to break free. Somehow, I managed to land a solid hit on the thing's side, and it let out this horrible screeching sound before releasing me. I scrambled back, half crawling, half limping toward the camp. By the time I made it to my parents' tent, I was sobbing, barely able to stand. My leg was a mess. Blood soaked through my pants, and I could barely feel anything below the knee. I don't remember much after that, just my dad's panicked voice, my mom's screams, and the distant sound of sirens as they rushed me to the hospital. When I woke up, the doctors told me I'd lost my leg from the knee down. They said it looked like an animal attack, maybe a bear or a mountain lion. But I know the truth. It wasn't an animal. It was still out there, watching, waiting. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. That thing, it wasn't done with me. Sometimes, late at night, I can still hear it, the sound of its footsteps in the distance, the rustling of leaves just outside my window. After the attack, life was never the same. You'd think losing a leg would be the worst part, right? I mean, physically, it was devastating. The pain, the recovery, learning to move around with a prosthetic, that was all brutal, sure. But what really haunted me was what I knew was still out there. Something that didn't make sense, something that shouldn't exist. And yet, it had attacked me, pulled me out of that tent, stared into my eyes with something far too intelligent for a wild animal. For months after, I tried convincing myself it was some twisted nightmare, my mind playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew the truth. Whatever had dragged me into those woods wasn't just an animal, it was something else, something worse. The rest of the family tried to cope in their own way. My parents, especially my dad, had this unshakable belief that I'd been attacked by a mountain lion. They said the doctors were sure of it, that it was the only logical explanation. Every time I brought up the creature I saw, the thing with human-like eyes, my dad would get this tight look on his face, like he was trying to force himself to believe me, but couldn't quite manage it. My mom wouldn't even talk about it. She refused to acknowledge anything beyond, It was a freak accident, and we're lucky you're alive. Megan, though, she knew. She never said it out loud, but I could see it in her eyes. Every time she looked at me, I could tell she believed me. And worse, I could tell she was just as scared as I was. She'd stopped sleeping with her windows open, even though it was her favorite thing to do when we were younger. She stopped going outside alone, even in broad daylight. It was like she felt it too, that we weren't safe, even at home. The nightmares came next. Every night I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding as the memory of those eyes, that inhuman scream, played over and over in my head. I'd dream of the creature, standing in the shadows of the trees, watching, waiting. And sometimes in those dreams, I wouldn't wake up in time. I'd feel its grip on me again, pulling me deeper into the forest, into some dark, unknown place, where the cold seemed to seep into my bones. After a few months, the nightmares started bleeding into real life. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, certain I'd heard something outside, footsteps, branches cracking, leaves rustling, but when I looked, there was nothing. I tried telling myself it was just the wind, the neighborhood dogs, anything rational, but that nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach told me otherwise. The worst part was the whispers. It started slow, barely noticeable at first. I'd be sitting in my room, trying to distract myself with a book or some show, when I'd hear it, just the faintest sound, like a voice in the distance, too quiet to make out the words. I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, a lingering effect of the trauma, but it kept happening. Sometimes I'd hear it in broad daylight, when I was walking with Megan or sitting at the dinner table. A soft, low murmur, like someone was talking just out of earshot, watching me from the edges of my world. I tried to ignore it. I really did, but it became impossible when it started getting louder. One night, about 6 months after the attack, I was lying in bed, staring up at the ceiling, when I heard it again, the whispering. Only this time, it wasn't coming from far away. It was close, in my room. I froze, barely breathing, as I strained to listen. It was clearer now, like it was coming from right behind me. At first it sounded like gibberish, like a low, distorted hum. But then, slowly, the words started to form. Come, back. My blood ran cold. I sat up, heart pounding, my eyes scanning the dark corners of the room. But there was nothing, just shadows and silence. I tried telling myself it wasn't real, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the whisper came again, louder this time, and more distinct. Come back to us. I stumbled out of bed, grabbing my phone, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold it. I turned on every light in the room, trying to banish the darkness, but the feeling didn't go away. The air was thick, suffocating, like something was pressing down on me. I didn't sleep that night. Over the next few days, I started to feel like I was going crazy. The whispering followed me everywhere, at home, at school, even when I was with my friends. I stopped going out as much, afraid that I'd hear it again, that it would be louder, clearer, maybe even closer. I kept telling myself I was just being paranoid, but deep down, I knew that whatever had attacked me in those woods hadn't let me go. It was still there somewhere, watching. Then came the final sign. It was a Saturday, and Megan and I were home alone. My parents had gone out for the day, so we were just hanging out, watching TV. The house was quiet, peaceful, and for the first time in a while, I felt like maybe I was starting to move past everything. But then I noticed Megan. She was sitting on the couch, staring out the window. At first I thought she was just daydreaming, but then I saw it. The look on her face. That same wide-eyed expression of fear I'd seen the night I was attacked. Her skin had gone pale, her hands gripping the armrest so tightly her knuckles turned white. Megan, I asked, my voice coming out shaky. She didn't respond, just kept staring. I followed her gaze, and that's when I saw it. Standing at the edge of the trees, right where the forest began, was a figure. Tall, gaunt, and unnaturally still. At first I thought it was just a person, maybe a hiker, but then I saw its eyes, reflective, glowing in the dim light, human-like eyes. My stomach dropped. It was the same creature, the same thing that had attacked me. Megan, get away from the window, I whispered, my heart racing. But she didn't move. Her eyes were fixed on the thing, her face pale with fear. Then, without warning, the creature moved. Slowly, almost gracefully, it took a step toward the house. And that's when I heard it again, the whisper. but now it was loud, clear, and unmistakable. "Come back to us." I grabbed Megan's arm, pulling her away from the window, and slammed the curtains shut. My heart was pounding in my ears as I dragged her into the hallway, my mind racing. "We need to go," I muttered, grabbing my keys, my hands shaking. Megan finally snapped out of her trance. "What the hell was that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we couldn't stay there, not with that thing outside. We bolted out the back door, running to the car, my mind a blur of panic and fear. I started the engine, my hands still trembling, and we sped out of there, leaving the house and that thing behind. We drove in silence, the tension thick in the air. Megan was still in shock, and honestly, so was I. We didn't stop driving until we were back in the city, the streetlights finally giving me some sense of safety. I wish I could say that was the end of it, but deep down, I know it's not. That thing, whatever it is, it's still out there, waiting, and the worst part, I know it won't stop until it gets what it wants. Because every night when the wind picks up and the house is quiet, I still hear it. Come back to us. I don't really like talking about what happened that night. It still makes my skin crawl when I think about it, but maybe sharing it will help me shake the feeling off. Anyway, this all started during what was supposed to be a fun night at a baseball game. You know, just me and a few friends hanging out, grabbing some food, enjoying the game. I didn't think something so simple, so familiar, could turn into one of the most terrifying nights of my life. It was early summer, so the air was warm, but starting to cool down as the sun set over the stadium. There's something about that kind of evening that always feels comforting. The smell of popcorn and hot dogs, the low hum of chatter, the excitement when the home team steps up to bat. I had been looking forward to it all week. One of my best friends, Dave, plays for the local team, and a few of us came to support him. He's been like a big brother to me ever since college, always looking out for me, always there when I need him. Around the 6th inning, I decided to take a quick bathroom break. The crowd was still buzzing with excitement over a close play, and I figured it'd be a good time to sneak away while everyone was distracted. The women's restroom was tucked away at the far end of the concourse, down a narrow, dimly lit hallway. It's the kind of place you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. I remember the flickering lights above, casting these weird shadows on the floor as I walked. As I stepped into the restroom, it was empty except for one stall. The place smelled faintly of disinfectant, mixed with something else I couldn't quite place, maybe mildew. I washed my hands quickly and was just about to leave when the door creaked open behind me. That's when I saw him for the first time. He was tall, maybe in his mid-40s, with greasy hair that hung limply over his forehead. His clothes were disheveled, and there was something off about the way he carried himself. His eyes, dark and empty, locked onto me as he stepped inside. My stomach knotted instantly. Men aren't supposed to be in the women's restroom, and there was no one else around. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I quickly grabbed my bag and headed toward the door, hoping he was just lost. But as I tried to slip past him, he stepped in front of me, blocking my path. "You lost?" I asked, forcing a smile to hide my growing unease. He didn't answer. Instead, he just stared at me, his eyes flicking up and down in a way that made my skin crawl. His lips curled into this strange, almost amused grin. "You here alone?" he asked, his voice low and raspy. I forced a laugh, trying to play it cool. "No, I'm with friends," I said, brushing past him and reaching for the door handle. But just as I was about to pull it open, his hand shot out, grabbing my wrist with an iron grip. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "Don't be in such a hurry," he said, his grip tightening. My mind went blank for a moment, pure panic surging through me. I yanked my arm free and pushed past him, almost tripping over my own feet as I darted out of the restroom. My heart was racing, adrenaline kicking in as I hurried back to my seat, my mind spinning. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a creepy guy who'd probably had too much to drink. But even as I sat back down with my friends, I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder, searching the crowd for any sign of him. I didn't tell anyone what had happened at first. I didn't want to ruin the night, and I figured it was over now that I'd gotten away. But a few minutes later, I saw him again. He was standing by one of the concession stands, watching me. His eyes never left me, even as people moved around him, oblivious to the growing dread settling in the pit of my stomach. I tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the game, but every time I looked up, there he was, always watching. After a while, I couldn't take it anymore. I leaned over to Dave, trying to keep my voice casual. "Hey, do you know that guy over by the concessions? He's been staring at me for a while now." Dave glanced over, his brows furrowing as he scanned the crowd. "Where? What guy?" I pointed him out, but by the time Dave looked, the man had disappeared. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, my unease growing by the second. "Maybe it's nothing," I muttered, though I didn't believe it myself. Dave wasn't convinced either. "You want me to walk with you next time you go anywhere? Just in case?" His voice was calm, but I could see the concern in his eyes. I nodded, grateful for the offer. I didn't want to seem paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The rest of the game passed in a blur. I tried to stay engaged, cheer when the crowd cheered, but my mind was elsewhere, constantly scanning for any sign of that man. After the game, as we were walking to the parking lot, that sense of relief I was hoping for never came. The parking lot was dimly lit, with long shadows stretching across the asphalt. I clutched my keys in my hand, the jagged edges sticking out between my fingers just in case. Dave and the others were walking ahead, laughing and talking about the game. I was trailing behind, my nerves still on edge, when I saw him again. The man from the restroom, standing near the entrance of the lot, his eyes fixed on me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. He didn't move, didn't say anything. He just stood there, staring, that same eerie grin plastered on his face. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. "Dave," I called out, my voice shaky. He turned around, following my gaze to where the man was standing. But by the time he looked, the man had slipped into the shadows. Dave walked back to me, his face serious now. "Are you sure it's the same guy?" "Yes," I whispered, my voice trembling. "He's been following me since the bathroom." Dave's jaw tightened. "Stay with me. I'll drive you home. No way you're walking to your car alone." As we reached Dave's car, I felt a little safer, but my hands were still shaking. The drive home was quiet, tense. I kept glancing in the side mirrors, half expecting to see that man following us. And then I did. A pair of headlights appeared in the rearview mirror, too close, almost tailgating us. My stomach dropped. I tried to tell myself it was just a coincidence, that it wasn't him, but deep down, I knew. "That car's been behind us since we left," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Dave glanced in the mirror, his face hardening. "Stay calm," he said. "We'll see if he's really following us." He made a sudden turn onto a side street, and sure enough, the car followed. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Dave sped up, taking another sharp turn, and the car stayed right behind us, the headlights blindingly close. "What do we do?" I asked, panic rising in my throat. "I'm taking us to the police station," Dave said, his voice steady, but I could see the tension in his grip on the steering wheel. "He won't follow us there." We drove in silence for what felt like an eternity, the car still trailing us at every turn. My pulse was racing, and my thoughts were spiraling, trying to figure out who this man was and what he wanted from me. Finally, the police station came into view. As we pulled into the lot, the car behind us slowed, then turned abruptly down a side street, disappearing into the night. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, my body trembling from the adrenaline. We sat there in the car for a moment, both of us too shaken to speak. "He's gone," Dave finally said, his voice low. But even though the car was gone, the fear wasn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, that the man would come back, that he knew where I lived, or worse, that he'd been watching me for longer than I realized. I stayed with Dave for the next few nights, too scared to go home alone. And while I never saw that man again, the memory of his eyes, dark, empty, and filled with something I couldn't quite name, still haunts me. I don't know who he was or why he chose me that night. But sometimes, when I'm out by myself, I still feel like someone's watching. And I wonder, what would have happened if Dave hadn't been there? I remember every detail of that day. The way the fluorescent lights flickered overhead as I sat in biology class, the muffled hum of voices in the hallway, the tap of pencils against desks. It was just a regular afternoon, boring even. I didn't know that within hours I'd be running for my life, heart pounding, sweat pouring down my back as a complete stranger stalked me through the dark hallways of my school. My name's Jake. I was 16 when it happened. You know how they always tell you that your life can change in an instant? I never really believed it. But that day made me a believer. It started like any other Thursday. I'd been zoning out during class, half listening to Mrs. Kent drone on about mitosis, when my phone vibrated in my pocket. A message from JJ. Meet me in the basement after class. Got something cool to show you. I glanced across the room at JJ, who was grinning at me from his seat by the window. JJ was my best friend, but he was also the kind of guy who always had a plan that was one bad decision away from trouble. Still, I couldn't help but be curious. The basement was technically off limits to students, but that never stopped JJ from exploring. As soon as the bell rang, I grabbed my backpack and headed down the narrow staircase that led to the basement. It was quiet down there, the kind of quiet that feels too thick, too still. Most students didn't even know the basement existed. It was used for storage, old desks, broken equipment, forgotten textbooks gathering dust. But JJ had a knack for finding hidden corners of the school, places no one else ever thought to look. JJ was already there when I arrived, leaning against a rusted metal locker, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "Dude, you're gonna love this," he said, motioning for me to follow him. We walked down the long, dimly lit corridor, the sound of our footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. The basement had this strange, musty smell, like old cardboard and mildew. It made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. As we turned the corner, JJ pointed to a door at the end of the hallway. "In there," he whispered, a mischievous grin spreading across his face. I rolled my eyes but followed him anyway. The door was cracked open, and when we stepped inside, I realized it was one of the old janitor's closets. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with cleaning supplies and empty buckets. But there in the corner was a dusty old walkie-talkie set. JJ picked one up, shaking it in his hand. "Found this last week," he said, his voice low. "Thought we could mess around with it." I didn't ask how he found it. With JJ, it was better not to question. We messed around with the walkie-talkies for a while, laughing as we tried to freak each other out by making spooky noises over the crackling static. But then something strange happened. Just as I was about to crack a joke, the walkie-talkie buzzed to life with a sharp hiss, followed by a voice. "All students and staff, please remain in your classrooms. The school is under lockdown." I stared at JJ, my stomach doing a slow flip. That wasn't a joke. The voice was calm, almost too calm, but there was something in the tone that made my skin crawl. We looked at each other, the walkie-talkie still buzzing in my hand. "Lockdown?" JJ muttered, his grin fading. "What the hell?" Before I could respond, the sound of distant footsteps echoed through the hallway outside. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. We froze, the air around us growing thick with tension. Whoever it was, they were close, too close. "I don't like this," I whispered. "We should get back upstairs." JJ nodded, his usual bravado replaced with a look of unease. We crept out of the janitor's closet, moving as quietly as we could down the dim corridor. The basement suddenly felt different, darker, colder, like the walls were closing in on us. The only sound was the faint hum of the old lights flickering above. We reached the staircase, and that's when we saw it. All the lights on the main floor were off. The hallways were pitch black, save for the faint glow of the emergency exit signs casting eerie red light on the walls. Something about it felt wrong. It wasn't just a power outage. This felt deliberate. JJ swore under his breath. "This is seriously messed up, man." And then we saw him. At the far end of the hallway, a man stood just at the edge of the shadows. He wasn't a teacher. I knew that immediately. He was too tall, his frame too broad, and he wasn't wearing the staff ID lanyard that all the teachers had to wear. His head was turned slightly, and though his face was obscured in the darkness, I could feel his eyes on us. The hair on the back of my neck prickled. This guy didn't belong here. "We need to go," I whispered, grabbing JJ's arm. But before we could move, the man took a step forward, his hands at his sides, fingers twitching slightly. I didn't know why, but the way he moved sent a cold wave of terror through me. Without another word, JJ and I turned and bolted back down the stairs. The sound of our footsteps echoed in the narrow staircase, our hearts pounding in sync with every step. We didn't stop until we reached the basement again, ducking into the first door we could find, the boys' bathroom. The moment we slammed the door shut, we pressed ourselves against the cold, tiled wall, trying to catch our breath. My mind was racing, thoughts colliding into each other like a storm. Who was that guy, and why was he here during a lockdown? JJ peeked through the crack in the door, his face pale. Dude, I think he's following us. I felt my stomach drop. Are you sure? He nodded, eyes wide with fear. I saw him come down the stairs. We have to hide. We scrambled into one of the bathroom stalls, locking the door behind us. The smell of bleach and disinfectant was strong in the air, the tiny space feeling even more claustrophobic than it normally would. My heart was hammering so loudly in my chest that I was sure he'd be able to hear it. We stood there, barely breathing, listening for any sign of movement outside the bathroom. For a few seconds, everything was still, silent, and then we heard it, the slow, deliberate creak of the bathroom door opening. My blood turned to ice. JJ and I exchanged a terrified glance, our bodies frozen in place. The sound of footsteps filled the room, each one echoing louder than the last as the man moved deeper into the bathroom. He wasn't rushing. He was taking his time, like he knew we were there and was savoring the chase. I could see JJ's hands trembling, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the stall door. My own breath felt like it was caught in my throat, the air in the tiny stall growing thicker, heavier with every passing second. Then the sound of the footsteps stopped. For a moment there was nothing but silence. I dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, he'd left. But then I heard it. Click. The sound of the stall door next to us opening. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. The man was checking each stall, one by one. Closer, closer. I could hear the faint rustle of his clothes, the soft scrape of his shoes against the tile. JJ motioned for me to follow him. We couldn't stay in the stall any longer, not if he was going to check each one. Slowly, painfully slowly, we crawled under the stall dividers, moving one stall over just as we heard the man open the door to the one we had just left. My entire body was trembling with fear. One wrong move, one small sound, and we'd be caught. We moved again, sliding beneath the stall walls, trying to stay as quiet as possible. I could feel the cold tile beneath my hands, the sharp scent of bleach stinging my nose. The man was still in the stall we just vacated, his heavy breathing filling the silence. JJ motioned for me to stay still as he peeked out from under the last stall. I could barely breathe, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might give us away. Then all at once, JJ opened the stall door and whispered, "Now!" Without thinking, I followed him, bolting from the stall and out the bathroom door. We sprinted down the hallway, the sound of our shoes slapping against the floor echoing in the silence. I didn't dare look back. I didn't need to. I could feel the man's presence behind us, feel his eyes on my back, the cold certainty that he was coming for us. We didn't stop running until we reached our classroom. JJ flung the door open and we both collapsed inside, gasping for breath. The rest of the class turned to stare at us, their faces pale with fear and confusion. Our teacher, Mrs. Kent, stood by the door, her expression a mixture of shock and concern. "What happened?" she asked, her voice tight with worry. "There's a man," JJ panted, still catching his breath. "He's got a gun." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, sinking into everyone's mind at once. The room fell deathly silent. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears as the weight of what JJ had just said settled in. Mrs. Kent's face turned pale, her eyes widening with alarm. "What do you mean, a man with a gun?" she asked, her voice trembling now, barely a whisper. She rushed to the door, quickly locking it, her hands shaking as she slid the metal bolt across. I glanced at JJ, both of us still struggling to catch our breath. We saw him, down in the basement. He followed us, tried to get into the bathroom. He's not a teacher. He's not supposed to be here. The class erupted into whispers, everyone exchanging nervous, terrified glances. I could see it in their faces, the same dread that was gnawing away at my gut. The reality of the situation hit like a punch to the stomach. There was a stranger in the school, a man with a gun, and we were trapped. Mrs. Kent snapped into action, rushing to the windows to close the blinds. "Everyone, stay calm," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, but the tremble in it betrayed her. "We need to follow the lockdown procedures. Stay away from the windows. Get down behind the desks quietly." We all obeyed, moving quickly, though panic was starting to spread. Desks scraped against the floor as we pushed them together, creating makeshift barricades. I found myself huddled between JJ and a couple of other kids, my knees pulled up to my chest. I could feel the cold sweat on my skin, the air around me thick with fear. As we sat there in the darkness of the classroom, every second felt like an eternity. I tried to keep my breathing steady, but my heart was racing. I couldn't stop thinking about the man, his heavy footsteps, his shadow in the hallway, the way he'd slowly opened each stall, as if savoring the moment. I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd find us here, that this wasn't over. And then we heard it, the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway outside, heavy, deliberate, just like before. I could feel JJ stiffen beside me. The room seemed to grow colder, the air thick with tension. My eyes flicked to Mrs. Kent, who was crouched near the door, her face pale but determined as she motioned for us to stay quiet. The footsteps grew louder, more distinct, until they stopped right outside the classroom door. My heart nearly stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, each second stretching out impossibly long. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and frantic in my ears. Then a single knock, just 3 slow, deliberate taps against the door. Knock, knock, knock. Every muscle in my body tensed. No one dared to move, not even to breathe. The tension in the room was unbearable, like the whole class was collectively holding their breath, waiting for what would come next. Then another knock, louder this time, more insistent. Knock, knock, knock. I saw one of the girls in the corner start to cry silently, her body trembling with fear. Mrs. Kent shot her a look, pressing a finger to her lips, signaling for absolute silence. The door handle jiggled. My heart leapt into my throat as I stared at the door, watching the handle rattle softly, as if the man was testing it, trying to see if it would open. He knew we were inside. I could feel it. I squeezed my hands into fists, my nails digging into my palms, trying to keep myself from shaking. Then the handle stopped moving. The footsteps started again, this time moving away, slowly fading into the distance. For a few minutes, no one moved. We stayed huddled behind the desks, listening for any sign that the man might return, but the hallway remained silent. Mrs. Kent stood up slowly, taking a deep breath. "We need to stay here until the police arrive," she whispered, her voice still tight with fear. "Everyone, just stay where you are." But something in me wasn't convinced. The dread in my gut hadn't lifted. JJ looked at me, his eyes wide with the same unspoken fear. We both knew that man wasn't done. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The silence in the room was suffocating. I could hear the faint ticking of the classroom clock, every second feeling like it was mocking how little time had passed. My mind raced with the memory of his face, or what little of it I had seen. That shadow in the hallway, the sense of being hunted. Suddenly, there was a distant, sharp bang from somewhere in the school. A gunshot. It was unmistakable. Panic erupted in the room. Someone screamed, and Mrs. Kent struggled to keep everyone calm. "Quiet! Please, we have to stay calm," she pleaded, her voice shaking. But the terror had already taken hold of us. The idea that the man was still somewhere in the building, with a gun, hunting for us, it was too much. We waited in agony for what felt like forever. My mind was spinning with worst-case scenarios, every sound outside the classroom sending jolts of fear through me. I kept expecting him to come back, to hear those heavy footsteps, to see the door handle twist again. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, we heard the sound of sirens. The distant wail of police cars approaching the school. Relief washed over me, but it was a fragile sort of relief, tinged with the fear that the man could return at any moment. Soon after, there was a loud knock on the door, followed by a voice. "This is the police. You're safe now. We're coming in." Mrs. Kent unlocked the door, her hands shaking. A group of officers entered, their faces grim but calm, moving quickly to check on everyone. The tension in the room finally began to lift as they assured us that we were safe, that the building was secure. But as the police began to escort us out of the classroom, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. They hadn't caught the man. They hadn't found him. He had disappeared, melted into the shadows of the school, and no one knew where he'd gone. As we filed out of the school and into the cold afternoon air, JJ nudged me. "Dude, he's still out there." I looked at him, the fear still fresh in his eyes, and I knew he was right. Even with the police swarming the school, even with the sirens blaring, the sense of danger hadn't fully left. The man, whoever he was, had slipped away, and he was still out there, somewhere. The police interviewed us, took statements, but there was little we could tell them. We hadn't seen his face, hadn't heard him speak. We only knew the terror of his presence, the sound of his footsteps, the way he had followed us through the dark halls like some nightmare come to life. Weeks passed, and the man was never caught. No one knew how he'd gotten into the school or why he was there. He was like a shadow, there one moment, gone the next, leaving nothing behind but the memory of fear. But the worst part, the part that keeps me up at night, even now, I still hear the knocking sometimes. In the quiet of my room late at night when the world is still and the darkness seems to press in, I hear it, knock, 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 and I wonder if one day he'll come back. I wasn't sure why I decided to go back. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that it wasn't real, that what happened all those years ago was some twisted nightmare my brain had conjured up. But deep down, I knew better. I knew it was real. The memories were too vivid, too detailed to be some childhood fantasy. Yet here I was, driving down the same winding road that led to the old town. My knuckles white against the steering wheel, my heart pounding harder the closer I got. It had been over a decade since I left. I hadn't been back since I was 12, since that thing appeared. My family had packed up and moved not long after, and I'd tried to bury the memories of this place. But now, for reasons I couldn't fully explain, I was heading right back into it. The sun was setting as I passed the rusted sign welcoming me to Willow Creek. It was barely legible now, the paint peeling off, the letters faded from years of neglect. The town itself hadn't changed much, though it looked smaller, emptier. Most of the shops had closed down. The few that were still standing looked abandoned, with broken windows and graffiti marking the once vibrant streets. There was this sense of decay hanging in the air, like the place had given up. As I drove through the empty streets, a shiver ran down my spine. I told myself it was just the cold air, but I knew it was more than that. The deeper I went into town, the stronger the sense of unease became, like the town itself was holding its breath, waiting. The real reason I'd come back, the reason I couldn't ignore anymore, was the woods just outside of town. That's where it happened. That's where I'd seen it. The thing, the one with the long arms and those awful, claw-like fingers. And that noise it made, God, I could still hear it in my nightmares. The tapping, the soft, rhythmic tapping of its fingers against the trees, like it was counting down the seconds until it came for you. I parked the car near the edge of the woods, the same place where my friends and I used to hang out when we were kids. We called it the Hollow, a little clearing surrounded by towering oaks. It was our spot back then, a place to escape our parents and the boredom of small-town life. But after that night, none of us ever went back. At least, I hadn't. The trees looked taller now, their branches twisting into the darkening sky, blocking out what little light was left. I got out of the car, shoving my hands into my jacket pockets to fight the chill that had settled in the air. My breath formed small clouds in front of me as I stood there, staring at the entrance to the woods. I didn't want to go in. Every instinct in my body was screaming me to turn around, to get back in the car and leave this place for good. But I couldn't. Something was pulling me forward, some deep, gnawing need to confront whatever it was that had haunted me for so long. With a deep breath, I stepped into the trees, the sound of my footsteps crunching against the fallen leaves, the only noise in the otherwise silent woods. The further I went, the quieter it became, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, pounding faster with each step. The air felt heavier, colder, like something was pressing down on me. I walked for what felt like hours, though it couldn't have been more than 10 minutes. The trees grew thicker, their twisted branches clawing at the sky, casting long, eerie shadows across the forest floor. And then I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. That slow, deliberate sound. My heart stopped. The tapping. Just like before. I froze, straining to listen, my breath catching in my throat. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the silence of the woods. But then it came again, closer this time. Tap, tap. The sound sent a cold shiver down my spine. It was the same as I remembered. The same slow, measured tapping, like the thing was announcing its presence, letting me know it was there. Watching. I turned around, my eyes scanning the trees, looking for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the twisted trunks and the shadows they cast. I took a step back, my heart racing, my legs trembling, and then I saw it. At first, it was just a shape, something tall and thin, almost blending into the trees. But then it moved, stepping out from the shadows. Its arms were impossibly long, the fingers stretching out like talons, tapping against the bark of a nearby tree. I couldn't move. I was frozen, my body paralyzed with fear as it turned its head towards me. Its face was wrong. The skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over a skull that seemed too large, with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light. But what really terrified me were its fingers. They were long, unnaturally so, each one ending in a sharp, claw-like point, and they tapped against the tree in that same slow rhythm. Tap. It wasn't fast. It didn't need to be. It moved slowly, deliberately, its eyes never leaving me. I stumbled back, my legs finally obeying me, but I tripped over a root, crashing to the ground. The thing paused, its head tilting slightly, like it was amused by my fear. Then it started moving again, its long arms swaying as it glided towards me. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding in my chest, and ran. I didn't look back. I couldn't. All I could hear was the sound of my own ragged breathing and the faint tapping behind me, growing louder with each passing second. The trees blurred past me as I sprinted through the woods, branches whipping against my face, tearing at my clothes. My lungs burned, my legs felt like lead, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I could still hear it behind me, that steady, relentless tapping. I was nearly at the edge of the woods, the faint glow of the town just visible through the trees, when I heard a different sound, the low rumble of an engine. I turned my head, and through the trees I saw a light, a motorcycle headlight, cutting through the darkness like a beacon. And then she appeared. A woman, dressed in all black, her face partially obscured by a helmet, came speeding towards me on a motorcycle. She didn't stop, didn't slow down, just reached out a hand as she passed, grabbing my arm and pulling me up onto the back of the bike. "Hold on," she shouted over the roar of the engine. I didn't ask any questions. I didn't need to. I wrapped my arms around her waist and held on for dear life as the motorcycle sped down the narrow dirt path, the tapping sound growing fainter behind us. The ride was a blur, trees whipping past us, the cold wind stinging my face, the sound of the engine drowning out everything else. I didn't dare look back, terrified that if I did, I'd see it, chasing us, its long fingers reaching out, tapping against the trees. We didn't stop until we were miles away, the woods long behind us. The woman finally pulled over at the side of a road, the town just barely visible in the distance. I stumbled off the bike, my legs shaking, my heart still racing. She removed her helmet, and for the first time, I got a good look at her. She was younger than I expected, maybe in her late 20s, with dark hair and sharp, piercing eyes. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice calm, almost too calm considering what had just happened. I nodded, though I wasn't sure that was true. My mind was still reeling from what I'd just seen, what I'd just escaped. "That thing," I started, my voice trembling. "What the hell was it?" She looked at me for a long moment before answering. "I don't know," she said quietly, "but it's been around for a long time." I stared at her, trying to make sense of what she was saying. "You've seen it before?" She nodded. "It's been following me for years. You're not the only one who's encountered it." A cold chill ran through me. I wanted to ask more, to demand answers, but before I could, she spoke again. "It doesn't stop," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It doesn't give up. It watches, it waits, and when it finds someone, it follows them." I felt my stomach drop. "So, it's still out there?" She nodded. "It always is." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the wind rustling through the trees, carrying with it the faintest echo of that dreaded tapping. I glanced back towards the woods, half expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back at me from the shadows. But there was nothing, just darkness. "It's not over," she said, her voice grim. "It never is." And in that moment, I realized she was right. I might have escaped it this time, but that didn't mean I was safe. That thing, it was still out there, somewhere in the darkness, watching, waiting. It all started with what was supposed to be a relaxing weekend getaway. You know, one of those trips you plan with your girlfriend and a couple of close friends. The goal was to get out of the city, unwind, and reconnect with nature. We found this cozy little Airbnb, a cabin tucked away in the woods of Northern California. The listing promised solitude, fresh mountain air, and even a hot tub overlooking the trees. Sounded perfect, right? I remember the drive up the winding road, dense pines looming on either side, casting long shadows as the sun started to set. It was a Friday afternoon, and the golden hour made everything look like a painting. My girlfriend, Sarah, was beside me, scrolling through Spotify, picking songs that matched the mood, while our two friends, Mike and Emily, were in the back seat, sharing jokes and snacks. It was that carefree, early weekend energy. You know the feeling, when you've just left work behind, and the adventure is ahead of you. When we finally pulled up to the cabin, it was even more charming than the photos suggested. The place was all rustic wood with a wide deck, and a view that stretched out over the tops of the trees. You could just about see the mountains in the distance. But what really caught our attention was the hot tub. It was already filled, steam rising off it in the crisp evening air. We all had the same thought. Tonight, under the stars, that's where we'd be. The first night was perfect. After a quick dinner, we were in the hot tub with beers in hand, laughing about old times, talking about nothing in particular. The stars were out, and the forest around us was quiet, too quiet. But we didn't notice it at first. It was peaceful. I remember leaning back, closing my eyes, feeling the warmth of the water against the cold night air, and thinking, this is exactly what we needed. No stress, no worries. At least that's how it felt. The first sign that something was off came later that night, after we had all gone inside. It was maybe 2 a.m., and I woke up to this scratching noise. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a raccoon rummaging around outside. But the sound wasn't coming from the deck or the woods. It was coming from inside the house. I sat up in bed listening, heart pounding a little too hard in the silence. Sarah was asleep next to me, breathing softly. I told myself it was probably just the house settling, the usual noises an old cabin makes at night. But when the scratching stopped, it was replaced by something else. A faint, almost imperceptible whispering. I couldn't make out any words, but the sound sent a shiver down my spine. I lay there, frozen, listening to that low murmur drifting through the air. I don't know how long I stayed like that, but eventually I convinced myself I was just hearing things. Maybe it was the wind outside. I managed to fall back asleep, though it wasn't exactly restful. The next morning, I didn't mention it to anyone. I didn't want to seem paranoid. But as the day went on, little things started to bother me. The atmosphere felt off. The weather had changed. The sky was overcast, and a cold wind had picked up, rustling the trees in this way that made the whole forest seem alive, like it was watching us. It wasn't that peaceful, serene place from the night before. We decided to go for a hike to shake off the weird vibes. The trails were beautiful, winding through the towering redwoods, the air crisp and filled with the scent of pine. But even out there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The woods were too quiet. No birds, no rustling animals. Just the sound of our footsteps crunching on the fallen leaves and the occasional snap of a branch underfoot. We made it back to the cabin by late afternoon, feeling more tired than we should have been. Mike and Emily joked about how they couldn't wait to get back into the hot tub, but I was starting to feel uneasy. I hadn't mentioned the noises from the night before, but I couldn't stop thinking about them. That evening, as the light faded, the wind picked up again. It howled through the trees, making the cabin creak. We were all inside, playing cards in the living room, trying to relax, when we heard it, the crash. One of the windows in the living room shattered. The sound was like a gunshot, glass spraying across the room. We all jumped up, instinctively looking towards the window, but there was no one there. No sign of anything that could have caused it. The forest outside was pitch black, except for the swaying shadows of the trees. "What the hell was that?" Mike asked, his voice shaky. "Must have been the wind," Emily offered, though she didn't sound convinced. But the thing was, the wind hadn't been strong enough to break a window like that. And even if it had, there should have been something outside, a branch, a rock, anything. But there was nothing. Sarah grabbed my arm, her eyes wide. "I think we should leave," she whispered. We all agreed. There was this unspoken sense of panic starting to creep into the room. The thought of spending another night there, no one wanted to. We packed up our stuff in a hurry, throwing everything into our bags without bothering to fold or organize. By the time we were ready to go, it was almost midnight. As we stepped outside, the cold air hit us hard. The trees seemed to close in around the cabin, their branches swaying and creaking ominously. The wind had died down, but there was this oppressive silence, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting. We started loading the car when we heard it again, the whispering. Except this time, it wasn't inside the cabin, it was coming from the trees. I could see Mike and Emily freeze, their eyes darting around, trying to locate the source of the sound. Sarah squeezed my hand, her fingers cold and trembling. It was like the forest itself was alive, murmuring secrets we weren't meant to hear. The whispers grew louder, circling us, though we still couldn't make out any words. Panic set in. I could feel it rising in my chest, and I wasn't the only one. Emily dropped her bag, her eyes wide with fear. "Let's go!" I shouted, trying to keep my voice steady, but it cracked with the tension. We scrambled into the car, slamming the doors shut, locking them as if that would somehow keep us safe. Mike floored the gas, and the tires spun for a second on the gravel before catching. As we sped down the narrow road, the whispering faded, replaced by the roar of the engine and the pounding of my heart in my ears. It wasn't until we were miles away, back on the main highway, that anyone spoke. Mike, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, muttered, "What the hell just happened?" No one had an answer. We just drove in silence, the weight of whatever we'd experienced hanging over us like a cloud. The strangest part, the owner of the Airbnb refunded our stay without hesitation. No explanation, no questions asked, just a full refund and a short message, "Sorry for the inconvenience." When I tried to ask about the broken window, about the weird noises, I got nothing. The owner wouldn't respond. We still don't know what happened that night. Part of me doesn't want to know, but I can't shake the feeling that whatever was out there in those woods, it's still waiting, watching. It's strange, isn't it? How something like that can stay with you long after it's over. You try to move on, convince yourself that it was just one bad night, an unlucky coincidence in an otherwise ordinary life, but it doesn't leave you. The images, the sounds, they linger. And when you're alone, or when things get quiet, they creep back in. After we got home, we all tried to act like everything was normal. We didn't really talk about it much, at least not in detail. I think we all had the same thought, that if we didn't talk about it, maybe it wouldn't feel as real. But there were little signs that none of us had really moved past it. Sarah, for example, started leaving the TV on at night when we went to bed. She'd never done that before. She said it helped her sleep, but I knew the real reason. She needed something to drown out the silence. Mike stopped going hiking, which was weird because he'd always been an outdoorsy kind of guy. He'd say he was too busy, but I knew better. As for me, well, I started noticing things. Little things at first, things you could easily brush off as your mind playing tricks on you. But then they started getting harder to ignore. It was about a week after we got back from the cabin. I was sitting in my apartment, working on my laptop late at night, when I heard a soft noise, like a whisper. I stopped typing, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, straining to hear it again. For a second, everything was quiet. Then, there it was. Faint, barely audible, but definitely there. A whisper, drifting through the room like a breeze. My heart started racing, and I immediately told myself it had to be something else. Maybe it was the wind outside or someone talking in the hallway. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, I knew what I heard. It was the same sound. the same whispering we'd heard in the woods that night. I stood up, walked around the apartment, checking every room, even opened the window to see if the noise was coming from outside. Nothing, just the usual city sounds. But that whisper, it had been inside. I was sure of it. I didn't sleep much that night, and the next morning I tried to shake it off. I told myself I was just on edge, that it was all in my head, but the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it got worse. Over the next few days, I started hearing the whispering more frequently. It was always faint, like it was coming from just beyond the edge of my hearing. But it was there, and every time I heard it, it sent a chill down my spine. Then, things started to escalate. One night, I was in bed, trying to sleep, when I felt it. A cold draft, like someone had opened a window. But when I sat up and looked around, everything was closed. That's when I noticed the door to our bedroom was slightly ajar. I was sure I'd closed it before I went to bed, but now it was open just a crack. I got up, walked over to it, and pushed it shut, my hand trembling a little as I turned the lock. As soon as the door clicked into place, I heard it again, the whispering. But this time it wasn't faint. It was right behind the door. My body froze, every hair on the back of my neck standing on end. I stood there, my hand still on the doorknob, listening as the whispering grew louder. It wasn't just one voice, it was several, overlapping, indistinct but urgent. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but I knew they were talking about me. I backed away from the door slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. Sarah stirred in her sleep, but she didn't wake up. I didn't want to scare her, so I didn't say anything, but I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. The next morning, I decided to reach out to Mike and Emily. I figured maybe if we talked about what happened, it would help. Maybe they'd experienced something similar since we got back. But when I called Mike, he was cagey. He didn't want to talk about it. He said he hadn't heard or seen anything unusual, but there was something in his voice that made me think he wasn't telling the whole truth. Emily was the same. She brushed it off, said we were just letting our imaginations get the best of us. But the more I pressed, the more distant she became, like she didn't even want to think about that weekend. So, I was left on my own to figure this out. A few days later, I was on my way back from work when my phone buzzed with a message. It was from the owner of the Airbnb. That struck me as odd. After the refund, I hadn't heard anything from them. The message was short, just a single line. "I'm sorry. I should have warned you." I stared at the screen, my stomach churning. Warned us? About what? I immediately texted back, asking for more details, but there was no response. I called the number, but it went straight to voicemail. I must have tried a dozen times, but every attempt was met with the same dead end. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the message. What had they known? Why hadn't they warned us before we went? And why now, after everything that had happened, were they reaching out? As I lay in bed, my mind racing, I heard it again, the whispering. But this time, it wasn't just in the background. It was loud, insistent, like it was coming from right outside the bedroom door. I sat up, my heart pounding, and reached for my phone. I turned on the flashlight and pointed it towards the door, half expecting to see it swing open, but it didn't. Instead, the whispering stopped, and in its place, I heard something far worse, a knock. Soft at first, then louder. 3 slow knocks, like someone was standing right outside the door, waiting for me to open it. I didn't move. I couldn't. My whole body was paralyzed with fear. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the knocking stopped, and everything went silent. Too silent. I lay there, staring at the door, my breath shallow, my mind spinning. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to open that door. Whatever was on the other side, I didn't want to face it. In the morning, I found scratches on the inside of the door. Long, deep grooves, like something had been trying to claw its way in. I still don't know what happened that weekend in the woods, or why it followed us home. But I'm starting to think that maybe, just maybe, we were never meant to leave that cabin in the first place. Maybe whatever was out there wasn't done with us, and now it's waiting for its chance to finish what it started.